In the last 4 years, we've seen the fastest money print in human history, the fastest rate cuts in human history. We have the largest election cycle this year in human history. Inflation, it feels out of control. Something happened in 1971 and it's catching up with us. So, what the F happened? What's coming down the pipeline from the escalating action to the money printing pirates, Larry?
Well, the money is broken, as we were talking about before the show, and that's been a long process. It started with the creation of fractional reserve banking, the Federal Reserve. It continued throughout the 20th century and culminated in the gold standard being abandoned by Nixon in 71. And it's just kind of gotten cumulatively worse and worse and worse. And now I think we're really in the point where it's becoming more apparent to everybody, and events are accelerating. So it's more important than ever to, if you're trying to save money, save it in things that the government can't print. And
Yeah.
Bitcoin is probably the best choice. And gold and silver are not bad choices behind Bitcoin. So
Yeah, Larry, I know you've got a big background, both gold and silver, and now with Bitcoin as well, which I'd like to dive into. But
sure.
the proverbial can that they've been kicking down the road, a lot of people are calling for the imminent collapse of the financial fiat system, like back in 2008, 2009. And then we had 2020, and it seems like they're just pushing it further down the road. Can they keep doing this indefinitely, or how's it play out?
I think Stein's law applies, which says that if something cannot go on forever, it'll end. I mean, the math is against them. They can't grow debt at a rate in excess of the rate of growth of GDP without eventually having the interest cost on the debt, create a crisis. And but you're right. I mean, it's gone on longer than it should have, and it could go on for another 5 or 10 years. Some people think longer. I kind of don't. I think we're going to come to a head here, in the next 5 or 10 years. But I also thought that it was going to be conclusive in 2008, and they managed to kick the can there. They've now taken it up to the sovereign currency level. I mean, we had a dot-com bubble, we had a housing bubble. Now we've got a sovereign currency bubble. And the way the government finances are set up, we continue to spend more than we bring in tax revenue, and therefore the debt is growing, and therefore as interest rates go up, the interest costs are growing. And it's, as James Lavish has so well pointed out in all his work, we're in a debt death doom loop where higher interest rates require bigger deficits, which means you got to sell more debt. Selling the same amount of more debt into the same amount of demand means higher interest rates, and winch rush repeat, right? I mean, it's a vicious negative feedback loop. And I think we're getting to the point where the can kicking is going to get very, very hard. I mean, right now we're in an interim period where we had a lot of money printed in the COVID example. And they've managed to kind of slow that down somewhat and tighten up a little bit by reducing the Fed balance sheet from 9 to 7 trillion I'm talking about. But eventually something else is going to break, and the system will not have enough money in it to function. And they'll be faced with a choice that they're always faced with, which is print money to keep the system going, knowing that the risk of that is inflation, or don't print money and let everything collapse, knowing that that looks something like 1929. And we know what they're going to choose because we've seen them choose it for 100 years. I mean, they chose it in Silicon Valley Bank. They chose it in 2008. They chose it with COVID. They chose it with LTCM way back in 1998. I mean, I've seen all of these in my career, and they just keep choosing the same thing. And and the excuse they'll use is the one they used in '08. I mean, Henry Paulson went to Nancy Pelosi, got on his knees, and said, "Look, if you don't give us this $700 billion for TARP, the ATMs aren't going to work tomorrow, right?" And
Yeah.
they kind of have a gun to your head, and they threaten, the Armageddon of the financial system unless you print. And guess what? The politicians put into that condition, put in those circumstances, they will print. So we know they will print, and I think in the next print, the Fed balance sheet goes to 20 trillion. And the thing that's important here, Sean, is that with each of these events, more and more people are coming to see it. I mean, a lot of people saw it in '71, and there was a big run in gold then, and a lot of the hard money people got it, but they managed to contain that by raising interest rates very high, and they could do that because sovereign debt was a small percentage of total GDP. But since then they've let things go in the other direction, and it just keeps getting cumulatively bigger. So to timing, I think we're going to see fireworks in the next 5 years, and I personally can't see how this system holds together more than 10 years. So I mean, I think we're on a sound money standard, or we have hyper Bitcoinization, sometime between now and 2034. Um, which is not a trivial amount of time, but it's not another 20, 30, 40 years. I mean, with each of these cycles, the problem is getting more acute. You know what I mean? So that's kind of how I
100%.
handicap it. And that would fit in, actually, that would fit in with a fourth turning theory. I mean, that this is a fourth turning, which is a, kind of a change in the rules of society, which it's described in a book of the same name. Most people know the theory. And the last one was World War II. The one before that was the Civil War, and the one before that was the American Revolution. These are in the United States anyway. And I think the topic of this fourth turning is going to be what is money, as Robert Breedlove kind of brilliantly named his series.
Yeah.
And we've for 2,000 years we've had the problem of monetary inflation. I mean, the Romans had it, and every every country and government since that time has had the problem, even to a degree when they were on the gold standard, because the supply of gold grows at 1.7% a year, which that means you compound that. That means the amount of gold that we hold in the world doubles every 40 years. So, you know, monetary inflation and monetary debasement is a problem that's existed for thousands and thousands of years. And that's why the invention of Bitcoin is such an amazingly significant technological innovation, because it takes this couple thousand-year-old problem and just puts an end to it. We are not going to have, if we all rely on a distributed ledger with a fixed supply, we are not going to have monetary inflation, full stop. So, that's a big deal. And I don't think people in the world fully appreciate it, because if they did, everybody and their brother would be buying Bitcoin. And, some of us are buying Bitcoin, but it's still, penetration of total investment assets is still relatively low, as you know. So,
How do we get from where we are now to having like hyper Bitcoinization, or where people wake up? Because most people can see the problems of inflation, what's happened with the high interest, all the money printing, and then inflated everything, and then putting the high interest rates up as well. Like, it's causing pain on all areas, and I want to go on a different tangent shortly, whether it's by design or it's just through to incompetence. But there's a problem. People are aware of it. Bitcoin is that solution. On your X name, you've got the saying or the meme, fix the money, fix the world. Bitcoin fixes this. But how do people wake up to the fact that Bitcoin is this thing? It's here now. It's ready. It's working.
I think it's just gradually. It's how they wake up to, I mean, when I don't know, when the internet was introduced, how do people wake up to that? I mean, there were those of us who were in it early, who knew what it was, who were excited about it, who realized it was going to change the world. But, at the time, my 70-year-old mother at the time was like, why the hell do I need this? And she wasn't going to get a modem and dial up and link into the internet. But, maybe ten years later, when all her kids had it, we were emailing each other and she wasn't on the email list. She said, hey, set me up on this internet thing. I mean, it's just, it's word of mouth, and it's penetration and knowledge on the part of the populace, right? And so, I figure there are probably about 10% of us who kind of get it or are aware of it. Maybe it's even less than that, but let's generously say maybe 10% of the developed world is kind of involved in this whole trade and in this area. And so, we're going to get to 90%. And, if you use the Gladwell theory of the tipping point, it took us 15 years to get here, in another 15 years, we'll be at 90%. And, I saw this with cell phones. I mean, the first cell phones came out, they were clunky. It was 40 cents a minute. Only the richest of the rich had them, and they make 5-minute calls, but they really needed to make those calls, so they paid for them. Well, now we all have cell phones. Calls are almost free. The monthly charge is de minimis for somebody who's doing reasonably well. And this is how technology works, right? It starts off as being a little clunky and a little misunderstood, and people are resistant to it. I mean, a lot of people are like, it's magic internet money, and you get all the normal pushback. But over time, they come to see that, hey, hang on a second, oh, gee, that thing you bought has gone up a lot, and that thing doesn't, this is an asset. This is something that if I buy, I can get a good return on it. And, we're encountering some of that right now. The thing we're having to overcome is that a lot of people are looking at it and say, okay, I get it. I like the thesis. You're probably even right, but gosh, how can I pay 60,000 when you bought it so much cheaper?
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to convince them is that, well, it was like, how could I pay, 2,000 or 300 or 500, whatever I started buying it, when Max Kaiser bought it for two, you know,
Yeah.
right? and someday, your grandkids will be buying, the price of Bitcoin will be 2 million, $3 million a coin, and they'll be saying, "Hang on a second, you mean to tell me you were buying a whole Bitcoin for $60,000 in 2024? Oh my God, how did that happen?" So it's kind of a cumulative thing as it gets adopted.
Yeah. And like obviously Bitcoin doesn't really have a marketing department. There's people
Well,
get into it.
me.
Yeah, well, that's right. But nobody's paid or incentivized to do it. It just comes from them understanding, just being like, hey, this is a great idea and fix the money, fix the world. Bitcoin does fix this. And they just want to share it. But maybe now we do. BlackRock came into the space earlier this year, Larry, and then he went on a bit of a Bitcoin roadshow. And you've got a Wall Street background, a gold and silver background, so you can probably talk to this a whole lot more. How's BlackRock and Wall Street come into the space, change Bitcoin adoption, the perception of it, and the way that this cycle could potentially play out?
It arguably brings some negatives because I don't have a high regard for Wall Street and some of these people, but in general, it also brings a lot of positives. I mean, the ETFs, as an example, as Saylor has pointed out, I mean, this is an enormous positive step. I mean, one of the biggest complaints that I used to hear when I was introducing it to people was, "Well, yeah, that's too far outside the system. The government's going to shut it down." Well, when the SEC approved it, that kind of put a kibosh on that argument, right? I mean, now, there's not to say they won't in the future change their mind as they realize that it's ruining their system, but for now anyway, the ETFs have approved it, and then Wall Street has jumped on board because they can see that it is an attractive asset. It is going to perform well. They can get a fee on it in terms of managing an ETF, and so Wall Street's all about making money, and they recognize that it could be the future. And the more visionary ones, I mean, Fidelity's been at it for quite some time. Abby Johnson got it very early. She was probably the leading kind of Wall Street type or investment management type to pick up on it. But like I say, I don't have an enormously high regard for Larry Fink. I know what he did, what he is, and where he's been. But that's fine if he now gets it and understands that what it is and wants to support it. Well, that's all good. I mean, my view is anybody who wants to support this new invention, which I believe is going to change and improve the world, as well as go up a lot in price. But forgetting all of that, I really want to see the world get fixed because I
Yeah.
think the world is terribly broken as a result of the lack of sound money and living in the fiat system that we live in. I mean, I'm writing a quarterly letter for the June quarter, and I just have a chart in there that shows um, the wealth distribution. And I mean, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the United States, 1% of the people own 50% of the wealth. I mean, and that's up 10x from the 80s. So I mean, this used to be a country with a middle class, and there were people who did very well, and there were people who weren't doing so well. But the broad majority of the people did okay, and it's really kind of getting divided into a haves and haves not society, and that has all kinds of negative social implications in terms of politics and anger and unfairness and so on and so forth. And so that's what really bothers me, and that's the biggest change I've seen in my lifetime. That I think I grew up in a country that, while not perfect, we were fighting the Vietnam War when I was growing up. Was a lot more balanced economically than it is today. It wasn't the oligarchs and then the rest of us.
Yeah.
Well,
Even here in Australia, it feels like the middle class is being decimated, especially in the last 4 years. I think that's accelerated. But even the 0809 financial crisis really felt like the start of it. I guess in my lifetime, you've been seeing the problem for a lot longer. You got into gold quite a while ago. What I guess triggered you to gold in the first place? Because gold then led into the Bitcoin
yeah,
side
I'll
of things.
answer that, but let's just finish up on your prior point. I mean, the really saddest thing is, and I don't know exactly how old you are, but the sad I've got kids all in their 20s, and the saddest thing is just how hard it is for young people. I mean,
Yeah,
they can't even afford housing. They're just scrambling to get by because all the money is concentrated at the older people who've lived off of this broken system, and some of whom have done extremely well. But to go to your next question about gold, so I came out of college and was an economics major and was taught Keynesian economics, but somewhere in all of that, and I had a macro professor, by the way, who it was really an asshole, but he gave me a C plus. It was the worst grade I got in college because I'd argue with him on things, and I was very much a free markets kind of guy in Adam Smith classical economics. Austrian economics kind of guy, and I was just slightly into it at that point in time. But I very early figured out that this system that we've got, this Keynesian system that we've got, that got really established in '71. When we broke the gold standard, Richard Nixon said, "Well, I guess we're all Keynesians now." I don't know if most people remember that, but I remember hearing him say it. And the fact is that that system in and of itself is inherently unfair and broken. And so I could tell that the money was no good after the gold standard was abandoned, and so I just started buying gold and silver. Even way back then. But at the time, that wasn't my primary focus. My career was as a venture capitalist, and I was very focused on investing in technology companies from 1983 until 2003. And I did that because my father had given me a book when I was younger, and he was very forward thinking, and he just said, "Larry, this microprocessor thing that Intel invented, this is a big deal, and I think it's going to change the world. If I were you, I'd get involved in things that are related to this." And so I wasn't an engineer, and I wasn't going to go write code, and I wasn't going to go found Microsoft or a company like that. But I sensed that there was something real going on there, and so I focused all of my investing in that area. And so I became a technology investor in '83. I just kind of watched everything unfold. And I think, by the way, that has helped me to understand Bitcoin because it is a technology. And I see enormous patterns between what happened with the internet and what's happening with Bitcoin. I mean, it's like a replay of the same movie. And so, um, I just kept watching things unfold and watching the money get debased in various different ways. And then it really started, but the '80s were, I wasn't paying that much attention to it. In the early '90s, I wasn't paying that much attention to it. The credit cycle was going strong. There was a lot of real growth. There was a lot of technological development. But in the mid to late '90s, things really started to change, and it really, in my opinion, it got kicked off with Alan Greenspan as the Fed chair, and he became much more activist. And it became clear he was going to print money as and when necessary to keep the system going. And so long-term capital management blew up in 1998. I remember it very well. I was short going into it. I was also long a ton of technology stocks, and I thought that was the end of that bubble. And of course, he came and he printed like crazy, and what that did was it drove us up to an even higher bubble in 2000. And when that bubble burst, then we saw the next step, which was, they cut rates to almost 0, 1%. And, Ben Bernanke blew the housing bubble. And, Greenspan and others were out there talking about taking home equity loans. So, and so as you could just see the Keynesianism playing itself out with each successive cycle in a larger way. I mean, it was LTCM was small. The year 2000 printing was small, but the bubble that got blown with the housing bubble, that was quite large. And since then we've had several others. I mean, so and we're really, in my opinion, in the biggest and the final one, because there's no higher level to go to than the sovereign credit level. And so it's not as if we're gonna leverage up Mars. I mean, I mean, we're done. And when the bubble at the sovereign credit level bursts, look out, because with that, as what Von Mises said is, there's no means of doing this other than stop the credit growth, which is a big depression, or debauch the currency, and the currency will fail. And so what I think is going to happen is slowly but surely the currency is going to fail. I mean, it's failing already. I mean,
Yeah.
in Bitcoin terms, the currency is failing, right? I mean, look at how much Bitcoin is going up. Look at how much the currency is going up. Give me just one second. I'm just going to close this door.
You're right.
You can either edit that out or leave that in. I just a little background noise I want to get rid of.
Uh,
Um,
that's that's
yeah.
all good.
So I don't know where I was. What's next?
Yeah, so like obviously they then jacked rates up after printing all this money in the last couple of years. We're coming into the presidential election in the US. They've sort of been happening all around the world, elections. But what do you reckon in regards to rates? Do they start cutting rates towards the end of the year and start injecting liquidity so everything starts looking good? Or
That
like,
would
what is your outlook?
they're kind of in a pickle, and it's hard to tell. I mean, they're a bunch of jokers. I don't know what they're going to do, to be honest with you, because they're behind the curve. They're it's hard to say. I mean, it's interesting. The ECB just did cut rates, right? So we saw that, and I think the Japanese did as well. There'll be a chart in my quarterly report that shows China is printing like crazy. So and they did cut the QT. I mean, Powell took the QT down by more than half, to 25 trillion a month when it had been, I think, at 60 trillion a month. So quantitative tightening is a way of, in a sense, reducing the money supply. So, I just don't know, to be honest with you. I mean, yeah, politics would suggest that there might be a rate cut in here, and they certainly need lower rates because the cost of interest is just continuing to grow in a way that makes the deficits bigger, and that's what I described earlier, the doom loop. The bigger the deficits get, the more bonds they got to sell. The more bonds they got to sell, the higher the rate goes, and wash, rinse, repeat. So I just, to be honest with you, I just don't know what they're going to do. They what I do know is that sooner or later they're going to be put into a position, and they're going to figure out something to sell it, as a way to sell it to all of us, that we had no choice, we had to print all this money. I
Yeah.
mean, the GFC was one of those instances. The pivot on the repo blowout in 2019 was one of those instances. COVID was one of those instances. I mean, maybe they're going to do it with a war. There's been a lot of saber rattling. That would be a decent excuse. But I think probably more likely what'll just happen is something will break in the United States. I mean, we saw it. Actually, we saw something break recently. Silicon Valley Bank broke in March of 2023, and they printed money and in a sense bailed it out. But I'm talking about something larger than that. Maybe the CRE market causes a lot of regional banks to get in trouble. I've heard rumors that there's a program in Washington being cooked up to maybe help out with the CRE loans, where they would buy bad CRE paper and put money into the banks. But, you know, I don't honestly know what it's going to look like, and nobody does because we can't predict. But what we do know, based on their pattern of behavior, is that they will not let the system fall apart. And that given the two choices, which would, I think, based on the monetary system we've got and the Keynesian rules that we're playing under, they're forced to either decide between, okay, we let the thing self-correct, and there's a big downturn, arguably close to a depression, and all the debt gets liquidated, and we start anew from a lower level, or we, decide that it's going to be so painful, so bad, the ATMs aren't going to work, etc., that we will create some new facility to print money, and we will put money out there. And I mean, in COVID, they wired money directly to people. I mean, they gave money directly to companies. I have friends whose company they didn't even need it. They
Yeah.
got huge, they got huge loans, and as long as they didn't fire anybody, those loans were forgiven. I mean, it's just like a shot of heroin from the government into a company. So, you know, they will do more of that, is my sense, on a go forward basis. And by the way, think about how unequal and how unfair that was. I mean, I think they calculated that, they printed. I mean, they took the balance sheet from 3 trillion to 9 trillion during COVID. It was something like $17,000 per individual in the United States, and they sent
Yeah.
the individual like $1,800 checks. Well, where'd the
Yeah.
rest? It went to those companies, right? I mean, it's so incredibly unfair, incredibly broken, um, and again, the other thing is that people's awareness is growing. I mean, when LTCM blew up, nobody knew about that. Nobody cared. The dot-com bubble burst. Okay, fine. There was some speculation in dot-coms. Great. The housing bubble burst. Oh, that's pretty bad. But oh, thank God we saved it. That was a once-in-a-lifetime event. That'll never happen again. Well, then COVID came, and oh no, there is something bigger. And 3 trillion becomes 9 trillion on the balance sheet. And there's another one coming. I mean, and so, Sean, what'll happen is more and more people are becoming aware of this pattern, and they're saying, "Okay, thank you very much. I'm out of here. I'll take Bitcoin, I'll take gold, I'll take silver. I'm not hanging out." And so eventually, the government's going to find themselves in a situation where they can't find buyers for those bonds at all. Nobody wants those bonds. I mean, who's going to hold a 20-year U.S. Treasury paying 4.5% if they know inflation's going to run at 5, 6, 7, 8%, which I think is very likely? I mean, the answer is nobody who's intelligent is going to buy that bond. And so then what happens? Well, then the government has to buy that bond or incent the banks into buying the bond, which is the more likely course. And that means that's fine, and that can happen. The system holds together. But how do you do that? By issuing new currency units, to the government or to the banks to buy the bonds, and that's the fundamental, printing of money, which
Yeah.
is just diluting the beer, right? I mean, okay, yeah, and so the good news is we're all going to be trillionaires or billionaires or certainly. The bad news is hamburgers are going to cost $500 a pop, and gasoline
Yeah.
is $100 a gallon. I mean, I'm obviously being joking and hyperbolic there, but I'm trying to make a point that that inflation is just literally built into the system. And what'll be interesting to see is the political reaction to it, because I think more and more people are coming. I mean, I know this, all Bitcoiners know this, but what are we as a percentage of the population today? We're certainly not half, or maybe we're 5 or 10%. I mean, I kind of I make the parallel between this and say, the American Revolution. I mean, I'm sure I think in the early days of the American Revolution, 5 or 10% of the people just thought, this British shit, this is just intolerable. These guys are trying to tax us, control. Fuck this shit. We want out. And it's interesting, even right up until the time when the Declaration was made, of independence in '76. Sam Adams or John Adams wrote that, a third of the country was patriot, a third of the country was loyalist, and a third of the country didn't care. So, and ultimately, the patriots won because they had a stronger and better idea and they cared more about it, right?
Yeah.
And the loyalists got beat, and the people who were on the fence kind of eventually came around to the patriot side. So, I kind of see the same. I mean, the same sort of. But by the way, that took from 1776 to '89. And I'm sure there were still some pretty bitter loyalists in '89. So the point is that it's going to take some years for this process to occur, but we're in it. I mean, we're definitely we're right in the heart of it now. When I was doing this in the '80s and '90s, I felt like I was totally alone in the wilderness. Hey, sound money. I was like, what the hell's that? Who gives
Yeah.
a shit? You know, Now I got 30-year-olds reading von Mises to me. I'm like, wow, this is great. I mean, they obviously have read Safe's book and they get it, right?
Yeah.
So
It's so, yeah, it's so incredible. Bitcoin incentivizes through greed, number go up technology. You come in here and then you get schooled in economic theory, MMT, start going down rabbit holes, the CBDCs, interest rates. Who would have thought, like I'm over here in Australia, that I'd be paying attention to what the Federal Reserve's doing on the other side of the world,
yeah,
but through Bitcoin.
you shouldn't have to. You should be able to just live your life and go about your business. But sadly, the Federal Reserve is the most powerful entity in the world right now. And I think my grandkids are going to sit around and view the fact that we have 12 Fed governors setting the most important price in the world is the price of money. The reason that's the most important price is it determines capital allocation, and capital allocation is what determines economic efficiency. So if we all want to live better lives, which we do, we all want to live better lives. We want to get more for less. We want to have our living standards go up. I mean, I live better than my grandparents did, and I'd like my kids to live better than I did. If we want that to happen, we have to allocate the capital properly. To allocate the capital properly, you got to have the right interest rates. Well, Federal Reserve has an interest as high as 20% and as low as 0%. Guess what? That's out of control. They're not doing it properly. Okay. The right way to do it is let the market set it. It balances savings against investment. And so just like the Politburo setting the price of grain screwed up grain in the Soviet Union, during
Yeah.
during Stalin's regime, they either have too much or too little based on where the price was set. The same is going on with the money supply here. And so we've got to set the money based on market factors and market forces. And that's what Bitcoin is going to allow us to do. And as I say, my grandkids are going to sit around and say, I can't believe you guys had 12 people sitting in a room setting the price of money. What the fuck were you thinking? I mean, Sailor in a video I just watched recently, I thought it was a great analogy. It's like, people are going to look back at it. It's like, I mean, as you know, when George Washington was dying, they were draining his blood. They thought bloodletting
Yeah.
was a reasonable medical course to help him with his sickness. Of course, it probably contributed to his death. And I mean, I think people will view the Federal Reserve and the system we had in the same way in 20 or 30 years. But we got to get from here to there. I mean, we're not there yet. And to be fair, I mean, I've always been a little too optimistic about how fast this is going to happen. It could take 20 or 30 years. I hope it doesn't. But I think we're well on our way, though. I mean, Sailor and Madeira said, that this is the golden age of Bitcoin. I think he's right. I think in the next 10 years, we're going to see a really big change, a really big shift. And that doesn't mean the dollar is going to fail. That doesn't mean fiat's going to go away. That doesn't mean central banks are going to be put out of business. I think they'll all still be here, but the balance of power is going to shift very substantially in the favor of sound money, in my opinion, in the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah. As long as it's communicated, the idea of Bitcoin's communicated clearly to the mass population, it's not distorted. It doesn't really take that long to be able to jump over to Bitcoin, that parallel economy. So, as long as the mainstream doesn't, you know, keep putting out that propaganda, misinformation, like what we see with Greenpeace
Yeah,
and people buying up the lies, I think within the next 10 years, it's like you're saying, that law, it took us 15 years to get to 10%, another 15 years to get to 90%.
yeah.
Um, be pretty interesting. Larry, we're seeing China start to offload US bonds. They're buying a lot of gold for their central banks. There's a lot of talk about the BRICS currency
Yeah.
as well. Is all of that just blown up out of proportion on social media because we're in that little echo chamber, or is there a concentrated move away from the dollar, and how could that play out on the markets?
I think a little bit of both. I mean, I think, look, the world is full of intelligent people in China, Russia, everywhere. And when the U.S. grabbed Russian assets after the war started, that was a really boneheaded move. I mean, that was really incredibly stupid. It basically told everybody, hey, you don't necessarily want to hold your assets in U.S. dollars or in the U.S. system, even because the government doesn't like you, they can grab them. Um, there's a trend away from the dollar as the reserve currency. There's just no doubt about that. If you look at the percentage of transactions of oil or anything else, you can see it's going away. But is the trend like going to are we going to stop using the dollar tomorrow? No. I mean, this is probably a 10, 15, 20-year trend, but we're clearly on it because you can see the Gulf states. I mean, oil is the most important commodity in the world, and the GCC countries are starting to accept other currencies to pay for oil. I mean, they've definitely been accepting the rupee. They've been accepting the ruble. And so they've been accepting the yuan. And my guess is they're going to probably start accepting the Japanese yen relatively soon. I think there've been, I've seen evidence that the talks along that lines are taking place. And then also related to that, what you're also seeing is that the U.S. Treasury bond and U.S. securities used to be kind of the stable reserve asset, so that if any country ran a surplus in their trade, they could just say, okay, fine, we'll just dump it into Treasury bonds. We know their money good, and there's a decent yield, and so on and so forth. So, but I think you're seeing that trend has definitely gone away because foreign holdings of Treasury bonds are now declining and have been since 2014, and you're seeing more and more foreign buying of gold. And I think, and maybe even some foreign buying of Bitcoin, but I think Bitcoin's probably not quite ready for it. And so my view is that these foreign countries are looking for a neutral reserve asset other than the U.S. Treasury bond, which is not neutral, but it was a reserve asset. And gold is starting to fill the bill. Now, I think they're being short-sighted, and I think one way the United States and other Western countries could leapfrog China, which is buying a ton of gold, would be to just go to a Bitcoin standard and skip gold. I mean, Say
Yeah.
points out in his book, like the way that the British did a much better job by going to the gold standard, and when the Chinese and the Indians went on the silver standard, they were disadvantaged because silver had an inferior stock to flow ratio compared to gold. Um, so we're seeing a move away from the dollar, and we're seeing a move away from the U.S. as kind of a unipolar, hegemonic entity in the world, and some people would view that as bad. I actually view that as quite good. I think that the U.S. has abused. I mean, it's rather sad to me when I look at what the U.S. was in 1946. At the end of World War II, we stood on top of the world. We had moral authority. We had a great manufacturing base. We had great people, and all of that. And sadly, as with so many things, I mean, success became kind of a curse because we didn't realize how we got there, and we started to around the corners, bend the rules and do things that weren't so good. The CIA, and there's a lot of history behind all of that, which we don't need to go into. But in my view, politicians in this country kind of pissed away, just an outstanding and leading position. Having said that, we're still an outstanding and leading country, and as a result of what we did, we were able to win the Cold War, which was a meaningful and important thing at the time. I mean, being able to get Russia to fall apart and stand down was a beautiful thing. But it's if a country misbehaves, eventually it catches up with it. And I think some of the things the U.S. has done have sadly caught up with us. And I think some of the things we've done have not really been in the spirit of the Constitution and our founding fathers. I mean, the founding fathers were not in favor of all kinds of foreign entanglements and wars and so on and so forth. And to me, the wars in the Middle East, which were probably largely fought over oil and some other things, those were just in enormous ways. Vietnam was in enormous ways. I mean, there was just a lot of, there've been a lot of stupid things, in my opinion, that the U.S. has done. But that is what it is, and I wasn't making the decisions, but I can observe them. And and then going off the gold standard in '71, I think that was just a colossal error, just an unbelievably colossal, short-sighted political error, because that's what set us on this road to where we are right now, which is that, we might actually have a monetary system that blows up, you know, and
Yeah.
and and if and when that does, there are going to be people that are going to get hurt. I mean, it's not let's not kid ourselves. I mean, it's unlikely that it's going to be a painless process. I mean, most fourth turnings involve, some real tragedy and some real winners and losers. Having said that, on the other side, if we reset, or if we're smart enough to avoid the full fourth turning, a full expression of a currency blow up, i.e., we reset to a sounder currency on some kind of controlled basis. I think we could have, I mean, once we're back on sound money, this is a great world, in my opinion. Great people, great technologies, no need to kill each other, no need to fight wars. I mean, it's our kids and grandkids could have, I mean, the things with AI, all the stuff that's coming, man, that's going to be fabulous. Okay.
Yeah.
But I don't really see how we get there with the broken monetary system that we currently have. Because you got, it's Jeff's point in Jeff Booth's, friend Jeff Booth's book. You've got an inflationary credit driven, we've got to grow Keynesian model pushing up against deflationary technology that says no, 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 it's all about efficiency and doing more with less. And the fact that these two are clashing creates a big, big problem. And that's why we're seeing it expressed in the way it is expressed, with all the income inequality and so forth. So I don't know, that was kind of a long-winded answer, right?
That's a good answer. So, like, the US is the biggest government or the biggest country in the world to hold Bitcoin, but they've just started selling
Yeah.
Bitcoin. Germany, as well, dumped a whole lot of Bitcoin on the markets. They've gotten this, like, the world's hardest money, arguably for free or for really little proof of work for themselves. And they're just selling it for something that they can make infinite amounts more of, fiat currency. So, for the smartest thing would be for them, they've gotten it for free just to keep hold of it. Didn't cost them anything. Why do you think they are selling it?
Well, I think at the political level, they just don't understand it. I mean, are you familiar with Jason Lowry and who he is?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, his book, which I read, was fantastic. I mean, and I've met him, and he told me that his belief is that actually the Pentagon and the military and the CIA actually understand the strategic importance of Bitcoin as the best neutral reserve asset. And if it were up to those three parties, I'm sure they would be buying, mining, and holding Bitcoin. I mean, but those aren't the parties that are making the decisions. The parties that are making the decisions are, the Congress, the executive branch, and all the politicians. And so, those people are, embedded in the fiat system and do well as a result of the fiat system, and probably regard Bitcoin as a threat and would prefer to actually see Bitcoin fail. And so, and they don't really understand what they have either. And so they're thinking to themselves, geez, if we could sell some of this Bitcoin, get some cash, and that helps, plug a hole in the deficit, yeah, that's all good. I mean, this is, Gordon Brown in London, in Britain, did the exact same thing. They call it Brown's bottom, right at the bottom of the gold price in 2000, when gold was at $260 an ounce. He sold all of the British gold. It's like unbelievable. It's just like one of the stupidest moves ever. And this is kind of, I mean, if we end up selling all that, I mean, I think the Bitcoin they got because they confiscated it from Silk Road and criminals and other kinds of things, right? They've gotten it
Yeah.
through law enforcement activities. If they don't hold on to it, they're insane. They're just absolutely insane. But honestly, the political class, I mean, I don't think the political class is particularly bright. I mean, I don't think they're very smart. And so, yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if they sold it all, which would be, in my view, which would be tragic. I mean, having said that, I do think there's some countries that are probably mining it. I mean, I actually think the Russians might be mining it. I mean, you see hash rate from
Interesting.
Russia. I wouldn't be surprised at a sovereign level if they get it. I mean, they're not stupid,
Yeah.
and I'm pretty sure some of the Gulf states are mining it as well. So, I think there are political people who understand its value. I'm just not sure there are that many of them that are in positions of power and in a position to change policy.
Yeah. We did see Bhutan was mining Bitcoin secretively.
I didn't see that. It wouldn't surprise me. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah. So that was a little while ago, but yeah, some internet sleuths found out that nation state was already mining Bitcoin. So it's Do you reckon, Larry, that we get to a point where people actively print money to buy Bitcoin?
Boy, I mean, as Sailor points out, when they do, that they win, right? I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, right. I mean, that's what Sailor's doing, right? I mean, don't you love the way he's able to sell these bonds at very, very low cost and turn it around and buy this super sound money? I mean, there's a guy named Hugo Stinnes who did this in Weimar, Germany, and became extremely rich. If you can borrow in the money that you know is going to depreciate in value, and invest that proceed your borrowing proceeds in the money that you know is going to appreciate in value, that's kind of a money making machine. That's kind of a turn the crank situation. So yeah, yeah, as Sailors pointed out, the first country to do that wins. I mean,
yeah,
they definitely win. I mean, I'm glad that China isn't smart about this. I think they've got kind of a real allergic reaction to Bitcoin, the way they threw the miners out. And I don't think at the highest levels of the Chinese government, or I'm not sure about their CIA equivalent or military, but I think the Chinese don't understand the importance of Bitcoin, and frankly, I view that as a good thing, because I think eventually we will get enough politicians and enough educated people in the United States who will understand the value of it, and we will start to, the government will start to hodl Bitcoin. I think
yeah.
that'll happen.
And it's starting, Bitcoin's definitely come into the political conversation over in the States. Like with Trump, do you know last night if he announced Vivek as his VP? Did that happen? Or?
That's certainly the rumor. His jet was in Cleveland, where Vivek is, and I think Vivek had a big part or a big role in getting him to take the position he's taken on Bitcoin. I don't think he knew much about it. I don't think he had a strong view of it one way or the other. But I think Vivek got in his ear, and I mean, my view is thank God he did.
Yeah,
And the game theory of it all, I mean, it basically forced Biden to back off of Elizabeth Warren's anti-crypto stance, because it became recognized that, hey, you know what, there's a real voting bloc out there that cares about this stuff, and if Trump's in favor of it and Biden's opposed to it, well, they're going to go with Trump. That's just how it works. So yeah, to the VP thing, I don't know. I think we'll find out relatively soon. And in fact, as we're speaking here, in about an hour and a half, I'm going to go watch the debate with my wife. So
yeah.
we'll see.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that debate had been on yet or not. Supposedly, this is when Trump's announcing.
It's quarter to 8 on Thursday evening in the United States. I believe it comes on at 9.
Yeah,
So
nice. I'll catch the replay. I've got something to do straight after this, but it was left field, and for sure as Vivek getting in his ear. It'll be interesting to see whoever gets in what the next presidential term looks like in regards to allowing people to self custody. But the likes of Dennis Porter, he's doing some really incredible work passing.
yeah, I've given him money. I support him. I love Dennis. He's such a great guy. He's working so hard. There's so many people in this space. I mean, Alex Gladstein, Cynthia, Loomis. I mean, there's just a lot of people who are fighting very hard for it. Caitlin Long, others. I mean, look, it's only going to grow. And I mean, look, this all these libertarian ideas are actually getting more widely accepted. I mean, I was blown away that Trump was, promised to free Ross. I mean, it's like, holy shit. I mean, Vivek must have really gotten in his ear, and
Yeah,
and then as a response to that, you saw Biden turn around, and they cut a deal with Assange. I mean, I don't like the deal he took, but he had to take it because he was going to
yeah.
die in prison otherwise. And I mean, what's next? I mean, we're going to have Snowden, come visiting the White House. I mean, it's interesting to me that the libertarian portion, and some of this is actually, I think, credit to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Who's made a lot of noise in these areas. The libertarian ideas are starting to be, broadly trumpeted, and even if RFK can't win, if he's making a lot of noise and he's got kind of 15% support, well, guess what? The other two parties are thinking, so okay, how do I pick that off? How do I get some of that so that it doesn't go to the other guy? And the game theory on it is great. It's really great.
Yeah, it's exciting to watch, and like even Javier Milei being um, elected, It's incredible. It feels like we're at a pretty important moment in human history with the money and the election cycle and everything else that's going on. But the right dominoes are falling as well. And we have Bitcoin, so I don't think there's a whole lot to despair about. Uh, I want to just find out a little bit more about your investment partnership with the gold. So you're still involved in the gold world. A lot of people in Bitcoin are Bitcoin only, gold's old school. There's no value for it anymore. But you deal with a lot of high net worth individuals. So how do the two come together, and sort of what are those conversations like with here's gold, here's Bitcoin?
There's some tribal warfare between the two tribes, but the fact of the matter is they're just two different assets addressing the same problem. I mean, the underlying, and that's why I've always said it angers me when Bitcoiners attack gold people, because gold people are your easiest converts. I mean, they already understand the underlying problem. Bitcoiners and gold people are just arguing about the solution.
Yeah.
And so look, I mean, there's a case, in my opinion, there's a case for holding both, right? And the allocations to both are everybody's individual choice. What gold has that Bitcoin doesn't have is a much longer history and lower volatility. And so, if you're 80 years old and you want to park your money in something that won't get debased over long periods of time and won't go down 70% on a drawdown, then gold is actually, a decent, savings alternative. Okay. Is it going to perform as well as Bitcoin? Hell no, it's not even going to be close. I mean, Bitcoin's going to crush it and already has crushed it. Will continue to crush it, mainly because it's sound money, but it's also and sounder. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, Safe once said, and I thought he was so right, is history shows that you cannot protect yourself from a world where somebody has a sounder money than you. I mean, in other words, and Bitcoin is sounder than gold. So
Yeah.
ultimately, Bitcoin will flip gold, okay, but not tomorrow, okay, and that's a process, not an overnight event. And so, my view is that there's a place for both. That Bitcoin is much better. It's got a lot more alpha if you can stand the volatility, and then ultimately it will flip gold, and ultimately gold will go back to its jewelry value. But when I say that, I mean I don't mean I mean in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I mean there will always be you've got 6,000 years of human history and 8 billion humans, many of whom don't even understand what Bitcoin is yet. You know what I mean? And they all understand. Pretty much all of them know that gold is money and has
Yeah.
always been money. And so that's a big Lindy effect that's not going to disappear, in a few years. But which is a better weapon? Oh, Bitcoin all day long. And and so I manage a fund that has gold and Bitcoin in it. Increasingly more Bitcoin, increasingly less gold. Eventually, I will be probably all the way out of gold. But right now, some of the gold opportunities and some of the gold mining companies actually have Bitcoin-like returns in them, because they've been kind of beaten up. And so I'm going to ride at least the next wave up in all of those, before I continue to allocate more into the Bitcoin space and less into the gold space. So as a professional investment manager, I mean, my job is to balance risk and reward, and I use these two forms of money as tools to do it. And I said this before. Gold is analog sound money. Bitcoin is digital sound money. We're moving towards a digital world. Digital is more important, but analog is not going away. And I will say one other thing, two other things. Advantage of gold: there's no track record, there's no blockchain, there's no nothing. I mean, you hand it is ultimately private, unlike Bitcoin. And the other advantage is once it's mined and you have it in the form of a coin, there's no additional energy expenditure. There it is. It's done. You're done. Whereas, the Bitcoin network requires electricity to continue running. I don't think that's a risk. I don't think it's a problem, but it is a difference between the two assets. And one other thing I say about gold is I think it'll be very useful for bribing the border guards when you're leaving your country. You know,
Yeah.
whereas they're unlikely to have a mun wallet, and you say, "Hey, I'm going to give you a bunch of Sats." They're like, "What?" But
Yeah.
you give them a bunch of gold coins, they know what that is.
Yeah,
So,
no, 100%. Yeah, just can you quickly download Wallet of Satoshi? I need to send you some Satoshis.
exactly.
Probably won't go down so well. Um, when you are talking to the people within your fund, Larry, do you ever talk about where you think the price can go, like price prediction side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I have some general thoughts on both the assets and what they're going to do and where they're going. I mean, look, I don't have a crystal ball. Nobody does. Nobody knows what the future is going to bring. It's all odds and probabilities. But they're both deeply undervalued. We'll get into some numbers on that in a moment. But in the next year, I fully expect gold to be over 3,000. It's at 2,300 right now. This U.S. dollars. I fully expect Bitcoin to be over 100, maybe over 150 in the next year. I mean, Bitcoin's going to outperform gold. I fully expect silver to be over 40 or $50 in the next year. This is just kind of short term, but I think the next year. I mean, and I could be wrong on all those predictions. I mean, because these things are very volatile, as you know. I think the bigger and more interesting way to look at this thing, Sean, is to say, okay, how much fiat stuff is there in the world? Well, there's a $150 trillion fiat, stock market, and there's $100+ trillion fiat, bond market, and there's maybe 50 trillion of fiat deposits and cash and other stuff. So maybe there's, call it $300 trillion of fiat, financial assets, and that's before you talk real estate. There's probably 400 or 500 trillion of real estate, but forget that because that's a sound asset they can't print. Let's talk about the 300 of financial stuff. So what? The Bitcoin market is 1.3 trillion. Okay, 1.3 compared to 300. 300 is a lot bigger. The bond, the gold market is 12 trillion, maybe 13 trillion. And kind of half of that's locked up. I mean, a lot of it's in museums and central banks and not really available for sale. So maybe 5 or 6 is available for sale, maybe a little less. So, 5 or 6, call it 5 trillion of gold and 1 trillion of Bitcoin. That's $6 trillion of two of the kinds of assets that can't be debased by government printing, which in my opinion is almost a certainty over a longer period of time. All right. So, what happens as some of that 300 trillion says to themselves, wow, these guys are really printing a lot of money. I'm losing out here. Yeah, I still have the, $100,000 I saved in my bonuses over the years, but boy, it used to buy me 3 cars, and now it only buys me 2 cars, and in a couple of years it'll buy me 1 car. Whatever the math is, and so they're going to say, I got to find something to save in that's not going to get debased. And it doesn't take. We don't need the whole 300 trillion to come over and decide they're going to buy Bitcoin or they're going to buy gold. We just need 10% of it, at a time, over a bunch of years to come in our direction, and you're going to see prices in gold and Bitcoin that I think are going to shock people. I mean, I fully expect Bitcoin to be, $1 million a coin in 5 or 10 years. I fully expect gold to be $10,000 an ounce in 5 or 10 years. I also expect that, the hamburger I bought tonight was $18, and I expect that would probably be, 35 or $40, and I'm paying about $4 US for a gallon, 4.50 US for a gallon of gasoline. I'm sure in 5 or 10 years that'll be 20. I mean,
Yeah.
it's because, and this is all the gasoline is the same gasoline. It's not that, it's just the debasement of the currency, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, hopefully people out there that are listening wake up to get as much Bitcoin, or if that's too much of a stretch, into gold and protects the savings, the purchasing power you have
right. I mean, I think real
now.
estate's a decent area too. The problem with real estate is they can tax it and you can't move it. So
Yeah,
you got to be careful on what real estate you buy. But it's, at least they can't print it. And I think one of the things, I think another error that I think investment error I think a lot of people made is they've looked at the last 40 years as being relatively deflationary, and they have been. I mean, China came online, brought the China price. There are a lot of technology and efficiency things that occurred to create deflation that Jeff has pointed out in his book. But we're now at the stage where the monetary system is breaking. Last time this happened was in 71. 71, gold went from 35 to 800. So, in a monetary system breaking environment that's going to be highly inflationary, you don't want to necessarily be investing in bonds or even in stocks. You want to be investing in things they can't print, because they're going to do extremely well. And so I think this next decade is going to be, it's going to look different. And that's hard for people. I mean, I was just writing my quarterly letter and I looked at the chart of NVIDIA, and, these people, I mean, everybody thinks the stock market's easy, right? I mean, it's since 2008, you buy the dip and it goes up.
yeah,
But, they haven't outlawed bear markets. And my opinion is one is coming here at some point. So, if you look back at the 70s, the last highly inflationary decade that we had, gold and oil were the two best performing assets in that decade. They were both up 30% a year, compounded, for 10 years. So, Now Bitcoin didn't exist back then, but I think in the next 10 years, Bitcoin will be probably the best performing asset in the world. Gold, silver, oil, and other commodities will probably be the second best category of performing assets. And I think that the Nvidias of the world are going to look more like the dot-com stocks of 2000. I mean, I'm getting a real March of 2000 vibe right now. I mean, I was an investor back at that time, and I remember just how overblown everything was. And I look at Nvidia as an example, or AI and all the excitement around it as an example. I think to myself, boy, I've seen this movie. It's the same.
Yeah.
It's the same. So
I think that's probably a good place to leave it. Something's coming. We've got the opportunity to be able to save in Bitcoin and outpace it. But what's one final message for people out there? They've either been in Bitcoin for a while or they've never heard about it until this conversation. How should they think about what's potentially coming and the part Bitcoin has to
well,
play?
it's not just. I would say to you, it's not just about number go up, and it's really about a new technological change. I mean, you know, the invention of Bitcoin is comparable to the invention of the printing press, or electricity, or radio, or cell phones, or take any, the internet or computers. Take any invention, and then map out how much it changes the world over the same period of time. And I think, some people say Bitcoin's on a larger scale. I don't know. I mean, it's not worth arguing about, but that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. This is a really important and meaningful invention, and it's going to change the world. I mean, just as I was walking around in 1981 when the IBM PC came out, I had a friend who was roommates with Steve Ballmer, and Ballmer said, "Hey, look, this thing is the software that runs these PCs. Everyone is going to have 5 of these in their house." It's 1983, and I thought, this guy's out of his fucking mind. How can he see that? But he was right. And the fact of the matter is, this is perfect money. It's money that cannot be debased. We've never had this. We've invented it. We never had it before. It's going to completely change the world. It's going to completely change the world. And so what I would suggest to you is, you don't want to miss this. And if you don't believe that, fine. But read everything you can read, study everything you can study, and make sure and come to your own conclusions about whether I'm right or whether I'm wrong. Because my experience has been that when people educate themselves about it, they eventually come to kind of where I am, even if they start off being extremely skeptical. And by the way, in the beginning, I was somewhat skeptical too. But there have been a lot of other attempts to do this before Bitcoin worked, which is why I was a little slow picking it up. I bought it in 2013, but in '09, 10, and 11, I thought, oh yeah, I've seen this shit before. It doesn't work, because they had eCash and Hashcash, and there were other attempts, and they had double spend problems, and nobody. But eventually, they put all the pieces together, and this thing does work. In 15 years, 840 some odd thousand blocks, it's working. And so that invention it's a really big deal. And so and you might think you're too late, but no, you're really not. I mean, this is Detroit in 1918. I mean, yeah, Ford invented the car in the early 2000s, but he invented the assembly line in 1913. But could he foresee interstate highways and everybody owning a car, and us driving around the entire country? No, he couldn't foresee it. But that's how early we are in Bitcoin. And I think a similar pattern is going to emerge. I mean, this is going to become the base layer of the financial system. Full stop. I think because it's better. And if that's the other thing I would say to anybody. If you don't believe any of this stuff, go listen to 10 hours of Sailor. Just go listen to 10 hours. I mean, right? Because you've listened to them. Go listen to 10 hours of Sailor, and then come back and tell us we're wrong. I mean, it's pretty. I'm not trying to be arrogant here, but it just becomes very obvious. And I think intelligent people. I mean, the conclusion, you can get really comfortable with the conclusions that you made. I'm extremely comfortable and very peaceful having 60-70% of my net worth in Bitcoin. Very
Yeah.
peaceful. I know that my kids and my family are going to be very well served by that decision. So I think everyone should consider that on a go forward basis.
100%. It simply comes down to a lack of information of not making that switch.
Right. I think that's right. I mean, yeah, you got to study it. And the thing that's neat, you alluded to this earlier in our conversation. You start in with just the number goes up. It sucks you in 'cause, oh, it's greed. Oh, I'm gonna buy this thing and make a lot of money. then then as you come to study it more, and you realize it's a lot more than that. In fact,
Yeah.
that's a small piece of it. It's really about the world gets better. You know, I mean, I look around and everything is broken, and I think to myself, "Hey, I don't care about the number going up as much as I just want the world to get better." And because I know what the fiat has done to the world, it's bad and getting worse, and I don't like that. You know, I don't like that at all. I want to see the world get better, and I think Bitcoin will help the world get better. So.
Fix the money, fix the world. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I full credit to Marty Bent. I think he said that before I did. I'm not. I didn't really coin that phrase. I grabbed it somewhere off the internet. I'm pretty sure it was Marty who said it first. But I've run with it. So
Yeah. Yeah, shout out to Marty Bent. I'll put his links below. Lawrence, I'll put all your links below where people can find you as well.
yeah, great. Great to be with you. Happy to come back anytime. I love talking about Bitcoin.